Everyone, Keelan, good morning. We're now in session. This is a City Council work session. Today's date is February 6, 2020. Thank you, colleagues, for your time today. Just a little bit of house cleaning. I'm not sure the public knows this broadly, but we have pushed off the work session on body-worn cameras. We're still going to do it, but we wanted to focus our efforts today on the gun violence reduction team. So we will make a public notification at some point in the near future about when we are rescheduling body-worn cameras too. Since I took office 3 years ago, I've been humbled by the history and the complexity and the community wisdom surrounding the issues that this council grapples with on a day-to-day basis. And nowhere is this more true than on the matters of community safety. And today's topic is probably somewhere near the top of the list in terms of issues related to community safety. Gun violence is a significant problem across the country, and the solution is both long-term and multifaceted. Federal, state, county, and city governments each have important roles to play. Parents, teachers, librarians, and many others also have a role to play. The private and the public sector each have a role to play. Relative to all of that, the piece we're going to talk about today is relatively small. It is a small part of the overall systematic approach, but it's the part that this council controls, and it's the largest part of our community's day-to-day experience with guns and gun violence. Today, you're going to hear from our city's two leads on this work, the Office of Youth Violence Prevention and the Gun Violence Reduction Team. They'll tell you how they think about this work, why they do it, how they do it, and how they fit into the bigger picture and the larger system that I described a moment ago. You're going to hear about their operations, their priorities, and how they're working together in collaboration today, and how they plan to continue building on their partnerships going forward. I'm very pleased with their work, and I'm glad that we'll have this opportunity to hear from them directly. I also want to say that this work continues to evolve. GVRT was formed in 2018 to specifically address all gun violence across the city. Their model changed. They implemented a data-driven and more collaborative approach to the issue. The Office of Youth Violence Prevention was established back in 2006. OYVP, as it's called, has done truly amazing work building a community coalition of young people, pastors, community leaders, all working together to help those most vulnerable in our community. There is what I would describe hard-earned and reasonable distrust of the city in this work. What I want to say to those who have historically not been served well by this system is that I understand that and we understand that. And acknowledging that legacy and evolving away from that legacy is part of the hard work that we do on a day-to-day basis. This council and I, and my role as police commissioner and commissioner in charge of the Office of Youth Violence Prevention, are committed to leading us to a better place by listening, by changing, and by continuing to increase your trust in the work that we do. Today is a work session, and there's no specific decisions before us. I hope that today is the beginning of a very thoughtful and transparent conversation about the city's holistic response to gun violence and how we can best keep our community safe. Thank you again, colleagues, for engaging this conversation, for giving your time, your energy, and your wisdom to these policy questions and conversations. I look forward to the conversation. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything before we begin, or we can just jump right in. So based on our past experience, what I would suggest is we go through the presentation, people jot down any questions they may have. If there's a specific clarification to a slide that we're on, go ahead and ask the question at that time. But for bigger picture questions, let's see if we can get through the presentation and then we can ask the questions.
And is it true that the presentation is going to be 20, 25 minutes, something like that?
Hopefully 15 to 20. Yeah, that's what we're aiming for.
Excellent. Thank you.
That doesn't seem good. There, okay. let's switch out Andrew's microphone. Here, use mine.
Reach. Get the presentation up.
That's just the microphone.
Good morning. I'm Andrew Shear, Assistant Chief of Police for the Portland Police Bureau, and with me is Nike Green and Tom Peavy from the Mayor's Office of Youth Violence Prevention. I want to thank you all for the invitation today to discuss how gun violence impacts our Portland community and what we are doing to address it. In 2018, we embraced a comprehensive approach to violence reduction alongside of multiple justice system and social service partners that is intended to best set us up for positive outcomes. Any one agency or group working to reduce violence alone cannot be successful without an overall strategic collaboration, and we'll be discussing that further in the slides ahead. School shootings, robberies, domestic violence, gunfire used to settle petty disputes, and suicide leave physical, financial, and emotional trauma in their wake. Gun violence endangers everyone, and PPB responds to every single incident. Gun violence in our community affects us all, and the very seriousness of this issue cannot be overstated. A city weighted in gun violence cannot thrive. So what is the current state of gun violence here in the city of Portland? We are 21st in the ranking of cities based on reported violent crime rate. We fall right between New York City and Austin, Texas. So in comparison to those cities, Portland is relatively safe. That's partly due to the commitment of PPB and its partners, including OYVP, on continually striving to reduce gun violence. However, for some people in our community, the danger is very real.
Good morning. So gun violence is a public health issue that individuals and communities actually can change, that community partners and strategic partnerships are keys to success. Rigorous, scientific, and professional ways of working are essential for their effectiveness. Hence why we sit here today, not to only unpack one department's role or one bureau's role in this collective fight against gun violence, but to share how each partner fights side by side in our strategic joint efforts to stop the trauma. So what does gun-related violence look like? It's murder, it's suicide, it's hate crimes, it's domestic violence, it's gang involvement, drug involvement, it's robbery, it's accidents, it's even brandishing. So the GVRT and OYVP are the strategic partner services we're highlighting today. But let us not forget, we are part of a larger, essential collective movement of partners fighting against gun-related violence. Moreover, we witnessed this collective effort and passion and concern at a press conference last Thursday around the We Are the Caution campaign led by our community, the most impacted, where we had a room represented by community members, those directly impacted, senators, county commissioners, students, faith leaders, nonprofit organizations, U.S. Attorney's Office, GVRT, Portland Police Bureau, all in the room understanding that it takes a collective effort.
I want to now share with you what is occurring right here in the city of Portland. Oh, I think we lost the slide. As of Monday of this week, in the year 2020, a shooting incident has occurred on average every 13 hours. A shooting incident is when we know a gun was discharged in the city, we're able to verify that it occurred, and a police report is taken. We have non-injury shootings, we have injury shootings, and we have fatal shootings. So far this year, someone has been struck and injured by gunfire a little over every 2 days. Last year, 110 people were shot, 22 of them killed, and several hundred were shot at, but fortunately not struck. The difference between life, injury, and death can be measured in fractions of an inch, but the lasting trauma impacts every single person involved. Thousands of shell casings have been recovered over the last year, and each one represents a bullet fired in this city. And we have reason to believe that the shootings that we know about may represent as little as 20% of what truly occurred in the city due to lack of reporting to police. Who in Portland is directly impacted by gun violence? We know that the overwhelming majority of those impacted by homicide or injury shootings are adult males in their late 20s and 30s. Very few involve people under 18 years old. Those directly involved in homicides are about 48% Caucasian and 38% African American. Those directly involved in injury shootings are about 51% African American and 39% Caucasian. While African Americans make up less than 6% of the population of Portland, they represent 39% of those involved in homicides and 51% of those involved in non-fatal injury shootings. And when we break it down even further, the data tells us there's just a few hundred people that are directly involved in shootings or homicides in a given year. That represents a small fraction of less than 1% of the population. So we have a small population that is currently vulnerable to imminent risk of death or serious physical injury without both police and community intervention. There is no group more directly and disproportionately affected by gun violence in Portland than African American adult males. What are the financial costs of gun violence to the city? Along with the human toll comes directly measurable costs that include lost income and spending, employer costs, police and criminal justice response, and healthcare treatment. There are also indirect costs as a result associated with fewer jobs, lost business, lower property values, and the cost of gun violence most often burden areas and populations that are already economically and socially marginalized. Studies by the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform show that a single injury shooting costs a community, depending on the city, between $500,000 and $1 million each, and the cost of a single homicide can exceed $2 million. The financial costs include crime scene response, investigations, hospital and rehabilitation, criminal justice system costs, incarceration, victim support, and lost tax revenue. We are currently working with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform on an economic cost of violence study for Portland. It's not yet completed, so of the studies they have completed, I selected a city that was roughly in the median cost-wise. I've attached the report in the packets I provided you, and it provides the breakdown of the costs in each of the packets.
What city is this?
This is Detroit. So remember that in 2019, we saw 22 gun homicides and 88 injury shootings. So with the math here, I mean, that expense to taxpayers could exceed $100 million per year. So at that rate, even a 1% reduction in the number of people struck or killed can save $1 million. So the reduction in human costs in terms of physical and emotional trauma and the loss of life is much more difficult to quantify, but it's arguably even far more valuable. Evidence shows gun violence begets more gun violence, and if you're harmed by a gun, you are more likely to be harmed again or to harm others. There's one study that I referenced in the back that showed that 63% of people directly involved in gun violence were shot on average 125 days after that initial exposure. Shooting investigations are time-consuming and labor-intensive. Witnesses and victims, even those who are gravely injured, often refuse to share information about the crime, even when they may be able to name the person who tried to take their life. This is understandable, and we don't necessarily blame them for their hesitation to cooperate. Some hesitation is probably due to a historical distrust of law enforcement agencies. Another factor is that those who engage in indiscriminate gun violence may retaliate against a victim if they learn the victim talked to the police. They intimidate witnesses and victims by creating fear that those who talk may be killed or their friends and family members may be targeted for violence. Sometimes victims would rather seek vengeance in the form of retaliatory shootings to even the score. That mindset perpetuates the cycle of violent retaliation. We experience this right here in Portland, and these retaliatory shootings sometimes continue on for years. One example of just that started here in 2013. Outside of a party at a nightclub, one person shot and killed another. Both were self-identified members of gangs well known for violent criminal activity. 2 other people were struck at that incident, but they survived. The shooter was apprehended out of state the following year and ultimately convicted of murder in early 2017. Between the night of the murder and when the shooter was convicted, 114 shootings can be directly attributed to that first event, with the first shooting occurring just 2 hours after that initial shooting. The actual number may be much higher, but without direct evidence, some shootings are suspected but not directly linked to this murder. There were several murders also that had a tie to this event. One was of an innocent pregnant woman who was killed during one of these retaliatory shootings that related back to the original event. A recent study found that gunshot violence follows an epidemic-like process of social contagion that is transmitted through networks of people by social interactions. Violence prevention efforts that account for social contagion have the potential to prevent more shootings than efforts that focus only on demographics. And this is one piece of evidence that's key to the efforts of our overall strategy.
Additional to the financial cost, let's not forget the community impact and its cost on the community members. Community members in neighborhoods where rates of violence are highest suffer from social impacts of trauma, toxic stress, and community tension. Research shows that across 3 domains, gun violence impacts our families directly. 1, learning and development, 2, mental health and behavior, and 3 being chronic disease and illnesses. Research consistently links violence exposure and outcomes that predispose individuals to be less likely to be healthy and raise healthy children, less likely to live in safe communities, and less likely to complete their schooling and maintain employment. Why? Because sometimes the normalization or even expectation of violence can lead to higher rates of gun possession, tension, and the resolving of even minor disputes with gun violence. The public health approach to violence also proves that, like disease, violence is contagious and can breed in the areas of social dysfunction. This is where we get the axiom, hurt people, and that violence begets violence.
So what is the Gun Violence Reduction Team? Who's assigned there, and what exactly do they do? The mission of GVRT is to investigate and disrupt violent crimes where firearms are used. They do so through investigative means, proactive intervention, and referral to prevention services. GVRT works alongside community partners such as the Mayor's Office of Youth Violence Prevention, Street Level Outreach, Multnomah County Parole and Probation, with an appreciation for the value of building relationships with all community members affected by gun violence. We understand that skepticism and distrust is real, which is why we must be thoughtful about our programs, policies, and accountability. In October of 2018, we redirected the focus of the unit from strictly gang crime to responding to and investigating all violent gun crime regardless of the motive. We added detectives and officers to handle the increase in workload. We put in place improved collaboration and information sharing with the Office of Youth Violence Prevention and other partners. And in a moment, we will share more about that and the Healing Hurt People program. We adopted new technologies and policies to help us specifically focus our efforts on shooters regardless of motive, rather than only those who were involved in gang-related crimes. All GVRT members have undergone procedural justice and implicit bias training, and GVRT will be the unit to pilot the Equity Lens tool currently being finalized by our Office of Equity. We've been working with subject matter experts, such as the California Partnership for Safe Communities and the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, to further develop and adopt nationally recognized best practices in procedurally just methods of gun violence reduction. GVRT does not conduct random patrol or engage in random enforcement. They do not engage in zero-tolerance sweeps or broad-based strategies like stop and frisk that have been used elsewhere in recent years. Aggressive enforcement of minor offenses can deter community members from collaborating with police to stop violent crime and diverts law enforcement resources from preventing more violent crime. Focusing law enforcement efforts on violent offenses and the people at highest risk to commit such offenses is a proven strategy for reducing violence. GVRT does focus on near-term disruption of gun violence and on individuals who are perpetrating acts of felony-level gun violence. Typically, those involved in the crimes to include felony-level firearms possessions and charges related to shootings, such as attempted murder and murder. GVRT builds relationships with at-risk individuals in order to disrupt the cycle of violence through engagement in a manner that is based on the premises of procedural justice. They treat people with dignity and respect. They give individuals a voice during encounters to create dialogue. They maintain neutrality in their decision-making and strive to convey motives that are trustworthy. Today, GVRT has a total combined personnel strength of 5 sergeants, 21 officers, and 10 detectives working across 2 different shifts. I spoke recently with 2 California police chiefs whose agencies underwent a restructuring and downsizing of their departments that resulted in the dissolution of their gun violence units. These chiefs made the decision to disband the specialized units focused on violent crime, and officers were assigned back to patrol duties. In the year that followed, in both Salinas and Stockton, both cities saw significant increases in shootings, and both cities set record homicide rates. Shootings increased and more people died as a result. I've included their quotes in the presentation and in the packet I provided you. In an effort to save time, I'm not going to read them in their entirety, but I will share a portion of Chief McMillan's statement. Not to be overly dramatic, but if you lose the unit which focuses on removing firearms from the hands of violent offenders, people will die. It's really just that simple.
The Mayor's Office of Youth Violence Prevention was created
Can you introduce yourself for the record?
Tom Peavy, I'm the policy manager for the Mayor's Office of Youth Violence Prevention. As stated before, the Mayor's Office of Youth Violence Prevention was created in 2006. OYVP, which is known as, reflects a priority as identified by City Council to build a more family-friendly city and increase public safety with emphasis on attacking root causes. OYVP coordinates with Pro-Social Resource Services, provides and manages grant funding, and enjoins community and problem solving. OYVP offers research information and facilitates communication associated with best practices and grant funding opportunities to supplement local resources. OYVP works with city bureaus, county, state, federal services, businesses, schools, faith community to provide consistent policy input, guidance, and advocacy to address youth-related violence. OYVP serves as grant manager for the following pro-social resource programs: the Street Level Gang Outreach Program, the Gang Impacted Family Team Program, and the Healing Hurt People Program. These grant programs are funded through the Office of Youth Violence Prevention and Managed, again, to assist at-risk youth and their families. The Street Level Gang Outreach Program it was modeled after a best practice recommended by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Comprehensive Gang Strategy, and also the Cure Violence Organization. The street level gang outreach workers build relationships with youth and their families with specific goals in mind to reduce conflict and violence, to support and assist youth and their families in assessing social and educational services while providing service as a mentor, life coach, positive role model, advocate, and mediator. The Gang Impacted Family Team program is a collaborative, multidisciplinary team involving city, county, state, and private nonprofit organization services. The team was created to provide pro-social service support to youth and families to break intergenerational ties that perpetuate gang involvement and violence within the community. OYVP supplies grant funding and office space for the Gang Impacted Family Team Coordinator position. Healing Hurt People Portland is modeled after a very successful program in Philadelphia, which has proven effective in 22 other U.S. cities across the country. The Healing Hurt People Portland program exists via a memorandum of understanding between Legacy Emmanuel Hospital and Office of Youth Violence Prevention Grantee Provider Service, Portland Opportunities Industrialization Center. The Healing Hurt People Portland Program Coordinator works out of the Office of Youth Violence Prevention and serves as a client connection to services. And we have Roy Moore with us today, who will describe more about the program. He is the Healing Hurt People Program Coordinator.
Thank you, Tom. I'm Roy Moore. I'm the Healing Hurt People of Portland Coordinator. Healing Hurt People, we respond to Legacy Emmanuel anytime a person of color comes in suffering from community violence. We take a trauma-informed approach on helping victims heal. We serve victims from the age from 10 to 35. We're there to bridge the gap between staff and to support family members as they try to heal. I think it's important to mention that I'm on call 24/7. So I'm there anytime that they need me. And it's imperative in our collective approach that I have with GVRT, because for me to get that call in real time, I'm able to be there and I understand the threat that I'm walking into. I'm able to understand the dynamic of what's happening at the hospital. Also, it's evidence-based practice that intervening in the first 4 hours of a victim suffering from trauma is the most impactful and crucial time, because that's when they're most likely to consider making a change. And so it's important that I get that information, that I know what I'm walking into.
Where do we want to be as we move forward? We support expanding the capacity of OYVP and its network of providers so we can remain focused on those most impacted by violence and those most likely to be caught up in the ongoing cycle of violence. We will strive to reduce the disproportionalities that exist, both in those who are impacted by violence as well as those who are contacted by police. As violence declines, we want to see fewer arrests and fewer police stops, as we primarily focus only on those who directly engage in gun violence. A reduction in violence results in a reduction in community economic costs, allowing resources to be used in other ways. And we want to make Portland safer for everyone, regardless of who you are, how much you make, or where you live. Below is a letter written by David Mohammed, the Executive Director of the National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform. I'd like to take a minute and just read a couple portions of it for the record on his behalf. I've included the entire statement in the PowerPoint slides, but I'm just going to touch on a few of the sentences in here. Although Portland's gun violence rate is low compared to other big cities, far too many, mostly young black men, are being killed on the city's streets. The enormous disparity in rates of gun violence victimization for black males in Portland is alarming. Despite understandable concern that specialized police units can produce over-policing in communities of color, well-organized and focused law enforcement efforts can actually result in less emphasis on enforcement of low-level offenses and better focus on the protection of human life. GVRT has been focused on reducing gun violence. GVRT's work can be effective in implementing focused deterrence efforts that actually result in fewer arrests but greater safety. So with a strong partnership with the Office of Youth Violence Prevention and their ability to administer service programs focused specifically on those most likely to commit gun violence, we can save lives, reduce economic burden, and lessen trauma experienced far too often throughout our communities. Similar holistic strategies have been implemented with success in other cities, and that framework is what we've been building alongside of our partners since late 2018. Investments in key evidence-based social service programs can reduce violence and recidivism while improving people's ability to thrive and contribute to the healthy growth of their communities. When social programs that reduce violence work in close alignment with a data-driven, narrowly focused, and procedurally just justice system, we can make a difference together. Gun violence touches all of us, and as a progressive city, we must have a strategy that protects our most vulnerable and underserved populations. There are a few graphics I added on to the end of this at the request of the commissioners from yesterday. I've added on a breakdown from 2019 of what made up all the shootings, and I apologize, I can't put it up on the screen. I've also included a couple of maps in there that show the locations of all the shootings in the city of Portland in 2019. Two different versions of the map. One is zoomed a little more so you can kind of see the hot spots that show more of the concentrations of where the shootings have been. And I also included a letter in there from our Multnomah County District Attorney and U.S. Attorney.
Very good. Does that complete your presentation?
Yes.
Very good. Before we get into Q&A, I want to acknowledge that Chief Resch is here with her command staff as well, and I want to thank you for being here.
I also want to thank you very much for the presentation, and of course, it's brought up about a bazillion questions, but I want to really start with, thank you for your presentation. I understand that, are you the only staff person now?
I'm not right now. Today, we're actually implementing our second staff member, Hyde Brown, who will be joining me today.
So you're
Yes.
about to have two of you.
Two of us, yes.
It's a big city,
It is.
and having two people that will be on call 24/7 is not a sustainable method of intervention, right? So I applaud that. I'm not taking anything against what you're doing, but I'm trying to make it clear that this is a limited resource that serves a very limited population in a very limited geographic area of the city of Portland, right? So I just want to be clear about what we're able to do today. So thank you for what we're able to do today. I guess my question is, clearly this is, if we're talking about this from a health base, then clearly it has to be run through a health environment, right? And this one is ran through Emmanuel.
Yes.
Have we been talking to other healthcare providers about being able to provide an additional type service like this in those geographic areas, especially those who have large numbers of community members of color? Because I don't think Emmanuel has a very large number anymore in that geographic area.
Well, they're one of the only Trauma 1 units, and so that's why we have the relationship with them. And so that's why we respond to Legacy Emmanuel. Yes. OHSU is the other one, and we don't have an
You
MOU.
don't have anybody there?
Yes, not currently.
That makes perfect sense. See,
We are in agreement with the capacity.
Can you turn your microphone on?
It's yellow, I mean, green.
is it green?
It's green. Oh, no,
It was kind of green.
it was kind of green. Yes, we're in agreement about our capacity, and we are aggressively working to build our capacity for funding as well as making sure people are trained. And we are looking at OHSU because if you look at the way they separate the cases and where they deliver, also is limiting. So if you get past a certain, I think it's
22nd, anything.
then those victims are taken to OHSU. So we definitely are in agreement there and are building that capacity.
Thank you. That's my questions about that. Thank you again for the work that you're doing. I want to go to the chart. Thank you very much for putting this chart together. The group-related number of shootings last year, what does that mean, group-related?
That through the investigation and talking to victims and talking to witnesses, we definitely know that there were distinct groups involved that were disputing with other groups, and that was a motivator related to that shooting.
And is there a ethnicity attached to that particular number?
We probably have the ability to pull that out, and that's something I could probably do for you, but I don't have that ready right now.
Because of course, when I see that, it's a different word other than gang member, but is it a different population? And so yes, we need to unpack that so that we know exactly kind of who we're talking about when we talk about group-related shootings. And the other and unknown is just because those were bullet casings that were collected at those sites, so no witnesses or nobody provided information?
A lot of times there are witnesses. I mean, we have a number of shootings where, let's say there's two cars with multiple people and they're exchanging rounds as they drive down the street. Witnesses call it in, we show up. We weren't able to talk to people that actually know who's in the car, so we don't know what the motive is, but that's a snapshot of the type of shootings that we go to where we might recover casings and no other evidence around.
And as I asked you yesterday, it's like, where do these guns come from? Right? Are these guns that are acquired in a robbery? Are these guns that are acquired, is somebody manufacturing guns in their garage and we don't know about it? I mean, where are they coming from?
The amount of firearms, I think, in our state and in the United States is frankly pretty staggering. A lot of these guns come from simple burglaries, car thefts. Because of the volume of guns that is just out there, it's not difficult for people to get them from a variety of sources. Sometimes they buy them at gun dealers. They might have somebody else go in and purchase it for them. Those are cases that we, along with our partners at the ATF, look at. But the vast majority of these firearms are probably taken in burglaries and car prowls and thefts.
One last question before I turn it over to my colleagues, at least for the moment. I'll get a chance to come back, I'm sure. What's my question? I forgot it. I can't believe I forgot it. I'll come back to it. It's okay. I appreciate the information that you have provided. I wanted some clarification on the question that 63% of people directly involved in gun violence were shot on an average of 125 days after the initial exposure. Could you tell me what that means?
So that quote is from one of a number of studies that we reviewed, and I think I put a link to that study at the back here so we can get more detail from that. But if I recall correctly, that was a study done, I believe, over an 8-year period in Chicago. And so a shooting would occur, whether somebody was involved in the shooting or potentially a victim of a shooting. And on average, during the course of that study, with I think involved maybe as many as 8,000 subjects in the study, that was the average they came up with.
Okay.
Here we go. I'm just waking up. It's hard to do with no coffee. Was the GET involved in similar gun violence reduction strategies?
GET was involved specifically in addressing gang members. Gang members involved in a variety of different types of crimes, some low level, some serious felony crimes, but their focus was just on people that were members of gangs.
Okay.
We've since changed the focus to focus strictly on gun violence and nothing else.
Okay. I would be interested to see some kind of year-to-year comparison on gun violence in Portland. Maybe not over the entire lifetime of the GET, but a meaningful number of years so we can get a sense of trends. Do you have any thoughts on why gun violence is on the rise despite these more focused efforts?
Well, to answer that and to partly tie into your first question,
Yeah.
prior to October 2018, as an agency, we did not do as good enough a job tracking all gun violence that
Okay.
occurred in the city. And so starting in October 2018, we've been very deliberate about tracking everything. So from October 18 forward, we have a very clear snapshot. Prior to 2018, frankly, there were some that would just fall through the cracks. Some might get coded as a vandalism, some would go to different units and be coded differently, so it's really hard to get a clear picture prior to that, which is why we've largely changed how we do business.
I see, okay. So GVERT is a response to a public safety threat, and I want to thank you for identifying it as a public safety threat, because as many of us know, it is, although the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are not allowed to research gun violence, which would certainly be helpful to cities across the country struggling to reduce it. So thank you for that. It's a response to a symptom of multiple social issues, and I see a correlation with our housing crisis. We're putting a lot of resources into trying to alleviate the end result of lack of access to quality education, lack of access to good jobs, lack of access to affordable housing, lack of access to mental health and addiction services, and so on. So I am really interested, we talked yesterday a little bit, just briefly, about upstream solutions, what kind of policies the city could be pursuing and what kind of upstream solutions you are implementing in GVERT.
GVERT specifically is the investigation. If somebody pulls a trigger at the rate that's happening in the city of Portland, their primary focus is on responding to these shootings and investigating and unfortunately holding the people accountable that pulled the trigger. They also engage in relationship building. They engage in community engagement efforts. They have great relationships with people all throughout the community, some of whom are involved in relatively violent lifestyles. It's not uncommon for a shooting to occur and uniformed patrol show up and then people at the scene want to talk to a GVRT officer rather than even the first responder officer. So I guess to answer your question, the ability to intervene in someone's life prior to them making that decision where they pull a trigger and end up in prison or potentially getting shot and killed themselves, that potential to intervene is, I think, where we really need to bolster our efforts as a city. Investigatively, we're not asking for more resources on the investigative side. We can use them. We are overworked and we're working 24 hours a day responding to shootings that are occurring. But I think the next step should be to further build out a capacity to provide the people that are specifically most at risk of violence with whatever it is that they need to prevent them from either ending up in prison or getting killed.
All right. I'm just going to suggest to my colleagues that there are a number of legislative priorities that we could be advancing at the state and federal level around reducing gun violence, and I'd be really interested in having that conversation in the future. Like I said yesterday, you never get credit for what doesn't happen. And I know that it's really hard to quantify how GVERT may be reducing gun violence in the city, especially since we have less than 3 years worth of data. But do you have any thoughts on, any thoughts on the impact?
I think the impact is we've realized a spike. Now, the numbers in short periods of time can be kind of deceiving, but when we first started tracking the data in October, November, December of 18 compared to October, November, December of 19, we saw slight reductions in injury shootings over those 3-month periods. Now we came into January and we had a big spike. So when we're talking about very small windows of time, it's difficult to really measure success.
Oh, yeah.
But I think as this continues and as we build our capacity to provide services to the people that most need them, as evidenced in other cities, and Oakland is one, I mean, they've realized drastic reductions year after year for 5 years in a row because of the infrastructure they have in place. It's proven to work.
That's all for now.
Commissioner Fritz. Commissioner Fritz has a question.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation and thank you for your work. I'm focused on what you said about the availability of guns and wondering, several questions about that. In your experience, are there things that we could advocate at the state level that would be particularly helpful in addressing the issue of the availability of guns?
That's a great question. I don't have a specific thing that I would recommend. Like I say, the volume of guns that is out there today is large. And so if somebody really wants one, they can steal one. They can potentially have somebody else buy one. I know that gun buyback programs have been done in the past, and they've shown to have very limited impact on actual gun violence reduction. Since we're focused on the people that are pulling the triggers, and we're not focused on necessarily just people that are possessing firearms, because there's so many people that possess firearms. As far as legislatively, I mean, there's obviously, and I know you already understand this, there's a number of laws on the books that make it illegal to carry a weapon unlawfully, to pull the trigger, to shoot at somebody and all that. So as far as an answer to the volume of guns that's on the street, I don't really have one for you.
I mean,
Okay, thank you. And then I was thinking back on the policy choice things that Mayor Sam Adams looked into in 2010, and I remember the zones, the hotspot zones, where it we designated particular areas so that people, excluding people. Let me hang on a second. I'm just looking this up here.
Some of
Do you remember about the hotspot zones?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we had drug-free zones, and I think we had gun-free zones as well. And as I recall, those were deemed to be not permissible at the advice of the city attorney's office, if I recall.
I think there was some racially biased implications from those policies, and we wisely chose to not implement those policies fully.
Okay. I do think it's helpful to look at what we thought before and why did we not do it. So that's helpful information. Is there anything? Do we have information on how many of the people who are doing these crimes are minors?
Very few. Very few people that are involved in either homicides or injury shootings are under 18 years old. I think 95% are adults. And the average age is between 30, 31, 35 years old. It's much older than we would think.
Okay, and did we move forward with the Mayor Adams's recommendation to hold people, to require people to report when their guns are stolen?
I'd have to research that. I don't have an answer for you on that.
Yeah, as I say, it would be helpful, I think, to look back, because this is not a new issue, as we all know. To look back on what we discussed before, and is there now a new, has anything changed that some of the things that were thought of before might be helpful now? Thank you.
You're welcome.
I want to go back to, I'm fascinated by the fact that we live in a city with over 600,000 people, and there are a couple of hundred people who are creating the bulk of the gun violence. So it begs the question, are we changing an organization of that protects and serves 600,000 people to impact a couple of hundred people who are shooting guns off all over the place, whether or not they're actually hitting people, but they're shooting off lots of guns, right? I think you told me there was 1,000. Is that the right number? How many last year?
How many shootings?
Yeah.
426 shootings last year.
426 shootings, and how many people were actually shot?
22 people killed and 88 people hit.
And so, again, right, there's a couple of hundred people that we have not been able to have a positive impact on. And so it begs the question for me that maybe we need a different approach or different tools to address those couple of hundred of people as compared to building up a program based on guns when most of the violence that happens in Portland is not gun violence. Most of the violence that happens are people, especially when white supremacists come with their baseball bats and their chains. Most of the violence that happens verbally. It's confrontational, right? So we have a culture of violence. And so to me, it's fascinating that we are and I understand that guns can kill people, right? No question about that. But if we're talking about a couple of hundred people, why are we organizationally moving in a direction just to have an impact on those couple of hundred, when the other 600,000 have a lot of other issues that they would probably like the police to be engaged in? So,
And I appreciate that. It's not just about the couple hundred. The couple hundred are the people that are doing it. But who we're doing it for is not just them, because we don't want them to make a bad decision and end up in prison. It's the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people every year that are shot at. There's houses that are shot. We had a teenage girl recently where a bullet came through a wall, and I believe she's paralyzed because of it. We had a woman shot in a Taco Bell drive-through a couple days ago, just getting tacos in the middle of the night. We had a family just a couple weeks ago, rounds started coming through their house, and I think they recently immigrated here from the Middle East. They all dove on the floor with the kids and everything to try to protect themselves because rounds were coming through the house. So we don't do it just for the 200, even though that's part of why we're there. We're doing it for the trauma that's impacting community members at large all throughout the city, as you can see by the map I provided you.
so what are we missing? What are we missing with those couple of hundred people? What pieces aren't in place to intervene in that activity?
That's a great question. A lot of the programs that have been successful around the country focus specifically on identifying who those 100 people are and going out and addressing those 100 people with a very strategic effort. People that have committed violence and there's probable cause or a warrant for their arrest, that kind of goes to the law enforcement side. The other people that are at risk but maybe haven't really committed the crime yet, but if you look at what they've been involved in recent months or years, those people essentially get diverted over to the social service side and they go provide wraparound services, and because they can tell some of these folks are going to probably end up in prison or get killed, and those are the ones we want to intervene with.
I'd also like to hear Nike's opinion on that.
So you're asking the exact same question that we're asking, right? What is missing? Where are the gaps? How are we not able to provide the necessary services that these families that are most impacted need? It is not a narrow lane, but it is a lane that we, as from our office, are involved in. And so we're trying to figure out where are the service provider. Old ways would we would hand someone a list and say, here, good luck. Here's some apartments that are available where there's housing. But we know with this higher risk population, the services that are needed, and we're building that capacity, is they actually need someone to walk with them. They need someone to be able to interrupt and intervene and see. You don't even know whether or not that person can read or not. You don't know the trauma impacted mental health. So building those service providers, that network that will, in good time, will say, yes, I will help. That's missing right now. We have a lot of 211, but we don't have those direct service providers there. The prevention lane and the intervention lane and the interruption, and we're building the capacity with those service providers right now to ensure that happens. And then the follow-up, literally for 18 months is the good practice with those families as well as those specific individuals.
You know, thank you for that. It's fascinating to me because I suspect, and I haven't been analyzing the police data, but just based on what I know from living in this community for 30 years, I suspect that those 30-somethings that are just come back from mandatory minimum incarceration, who are finding it difficult to get housing and education assistance and food support, I suspect they are a bulk of that couple of hundred people who are actually the ones that are out there angrily using weapons to feel like they have some power. I'm not a psychologist, but it's not rocket science to know when you put kids in jail for mandatory minimum periods of time, what you bring back are very angry men, right? Who, if they have no resources. And so, again, it sounds like to me we're trying to put some toothpaste on the dike, right? And if Salem is where they're coming from. And because we have a mandate, they come back to their local community, right? Without the resources, I might add, because the resources stay wherever they're jailed, right? So, I mean, this is not rocket science. This is a system that we've built that has created these men who are now coming back to our community, creating havoc. So.
Well, I want to thank Commissioner Hardesty for raising that issue because it's an angle that I hadn't considered in this conversation. But we know, for instance, with our chronically homeless population, that an extraordinary number of those individuals are formerly incarcerated. And that when we fail them, we are failing our whole community, because our community is less safe when people are not able to succeed in community. So that's something I'd be really interested in looking at. Since Commissioner Fritz brought up exclusion zones, which was a CATS era policy solution discontinued by Mayor Potter, that resulted in over-policing of communities of color, I want to talk about, I'm going to go ahead and mention the policy solutions that I think that we could pursue at the state and federal level. Because I know this conversation is specifically about your division, but we clearly need to be doing work beyond the division, beyond the bureau. So Oregon needs to pass that safe storage law so guns are harder to steal. It is not legally required in Oregon to report when your gun is stolen. I can't imagine not reporting a legally owned firearm as being stolen if, and I think that needs to change it all as well. We need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines. We need to enable the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to research gun violence as a public health issue. We need to require background checks for all gun sales. We need to disarm domestic abusers, and we need to make extreme risk protection orders available in every state. And finally, closer to what we're talking about here today, we need to support local violence prevention and intervention programs in the community.
So I'd like to build on that point, and maybe, Nike, this is directed at you, but I'd certainly like to hear AC Shearer's thoughts or Tom's thoughts on this, Roy's thoughts on this. Again, what I said up front was GVRT represents a small slice of a much larger system. This is the part that we control directly, that we are responsible for, that nobody else is going to do for us in our absence. And a key component of GVRT is the community-based partnerships. It is working with people and organizations and organic movements within the community that we don't manage ourselves, that we don't do ourselves, but we cannot be successful in GVRT without those community partnerships. Tell us how you specifically are focused on that question of intervention and prevention
Well,
with the
first-
resources we have that we control.
So I'll first state that in looking at some of the other cities that were addressing gun violence, they have things what they call false starts, where either a city or a police-led effort to reducing gun violence failed miserably because the community was not involved, because they didn't have the service providers lined up, because they didn't have a greater understanding of how vast the work was. The policy advocacy was not in place. The communities were not involved, so they weren't able to embrace. The prevention lane, intervention, and interruption lanes weren't being flooded and filled with those community members that were already providing those services, from the county level all the way to the faith leader, to the education component, to the mental health. And so it is necessary. You cannot have one without the other. There is a need for all those components. So what we're moving forward is, how do we get all of those people in place? How do we get them at the table? And we are doing that. I don't want you to be like, it's just, tomorrow. We are aggressively, within my 2 months stead, pulling those individuals to the table and really looking at evidence-based practices so that we can implement those strategies. Understanding each person's lane is necessary. GVRT is necessary. Our office is necessary. The faith community is necessary. Policymakers in the state is necessary. So we're building that constituency up now and bringing back those individuals to the table. We're sitting down with them, having conversations, from faith leaders to OGs to mentorship groups, to advocacy groups, to mental health providers, to just the ordinary community that says we have a bread shop that gives us complete access, instead of telling us, well, we can't serve your family now, we're not only open on Tuesdays. So it's that building of that work, and then looking at what is needed so those services are connected to the people that we're serving. So you don't want a low-risk service provider to be connected with a high-risk family. And so that's also understanding the population and who we're serving and who's actually impacted. Our office is all violence. And so we have to be very intentional about, when we're looking at specifically gun violence, on how we make sure those services align.
So Nike, you're gonna love when we bring Dr. J to town, who's a Harvard professor who has done analysis for the Fire Bureau on predictive fires, right? So he could show you a map and point out with 99.9% accuracy where fires will take place in the city of Portland. He's now doing the same thing around violence. And so when he comes here in March, I would love to get the chief and the assistant chief and your office really involved in a broader conversation, because I do think violence is a national crisis, right? And when we have people at the national level actually reinforcing violence, then it is percolated significantly in this community. And so, though I know the visible are the bullets on the street, I do believe that we know exactly where that population is coming from. The question is, what are we going to do about it, right? But we do need to make sure that we're looking at violence in the whole context of the entire community. Because you want to talk about bringing people on board, we have to. And because you've only been there a couple of months, I'm not going to ask you how your grant process has changed, since we're no longer focused on gang activity and we're focused on broader gun violence. And as you said, your office is more broadly focused on violence reduction, right? Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, I said we're focused on all violence.
All violence,
And
right.
so we look at the most impacted. And so right now, our most impacted is under gun violence.
And so I want to make sure that as you're considering who's getting funding, that we're not so narrowly focused that we're continuing to talk about gang outreach workers, because since we're not focused on gangs and we're focusing on individuals and individual behavior, then the grant funding should follow that philosophy and not be focused on gangs, right? Because if we don't have a gang enforcement unit, then we don't need a gang reduction community team. So, oh, and one last question. No, that was it.
So I wanted to get in, and I don't want to in any way disrespect the work that's being done by the officers, the work that's being done by the investigators. I obviously support it. I think it's super important that this other community component is a part that I don't think the public is necessarily completely aware of. Commissioner Udaley said something that made me smile down here, because I could so relate to it, which is you don't really get credit for what doesn't happen or what people don't see. And there was a situation, Tom, I don't know how much you can talk about this, but you and Antoinette, and then I believe Nike was later involved when she came on board with a direct intervention to try and disrupt, as you described it, as a public health contagion, that violence can spread the same way, and that's why gun violence is now recognized as a public health issue, in addition to being an obvious public safety issue. You do get directly and personally
Yes.
involved in those interventions. Could you talk about that?
Well, I'm not going to talk specifically about any family, but.
Of course.
Bottom line is, the workers that do the work, and, you know, I think the misnomer is that street-level gang outreach only deal with people that are at risk of gang behavior, which is not true. They're serving at-risk populations that are involved in a number of different violent situations. And when you get involved with that family, the communication lines about service and the most high risk, where the service need to go, are created. And it was kind of interesting, and I'll go from, what we've done in the past to what happened across the street when we were preparing for this opportunity here. We were talking about the Vancouver shooting that just happened recently. And amongst us, we identified most high risk, identified previous situations that were created for families that were involved, and talked about the possibility of service provision. So we had an incident that just occurred within the last, I think, 36 hours? And across the river. And here we are, because we have that nexus that we can step in and provide service to most high risk. So,
Thank you. Appreciate it. Commissioner Fritz, anything else?
No, thank you.
Okay, good. Is there anything else for the good of the order?
Just one last question. As I asked yesterday, I'm hopeful to get demographic breakdown data, and I would hope that the Bureau would collect that data on an annual basis because it's important for us to be able to track actually who's being impacted by this activity. Thank you so much, and I appreciate all the work you all are doing. No, my questions are not meant to imply that I'm not committed to making sure that the city of Portland is a safe one. I have the rest of the first responders in my portfolio, so I have an investment in making sure that our first responders are fully supported. I question my own bureau, so just because I question you doesn't mean I don't respect the work that you do, okay?
Appreciate that.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Could I ask one more? I'm sorry to throw this right at the end, and it's maybe a question that's not even a fair one or one that you can even answer. But this is not just a Portland trend, this sudden spike in gun violence. This is a national trend. We're seeing it all over the place. Do we know why?
I do not know the reason for that, whether we talk about a culture of violence, whether we talk about a proliferation of firearms, whether we talk about just general attitude changes culturally, nationally, and people's less value on human life, more willingness to pull the trigger to settle petty disputes. I mean, it's a combination of factors, I think, but I don't have a straight answer.
Okay, great.
And just one thing for Commissioner Hardesty, so the demographics and the data, we are currently working on an outward-facing dashboard specific to gun violence that will show the locations, and I think we have the ability to push out real time, anytime you check on it, could show demographics as well, so that's something we'll look at.
I appreciate that, but I don't normally go to websites to get information, so, the mayor used to tell me that, oh, it's on my website. Well, right, so it would be helpful if we actually had a real report.
Sure.
That we could then refer to. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all, and thanks for the incredible work that you all do. We really appreciate it, and your teams. Thank you. We're adjourned.